Good to see everybody.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Fellows Colloquium. Today our speaker is Stuart Hall Fellow James Smethurst. Professor Smethurst is Professor of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He is the author of such central texts as The New Red Negro, The Literary Left in African American Poetry, 1930-1946, The Black Arts Movement, Literary Nationalism in the 1960s and 1970s, The African American Roots of Modernism from Reconstruction to the Harlem Renaissance, and Brick City Vanguard, Amiri Baraka, Black Music, Black Modernity, and finally, Behold the Land, A History of the Black Arts Movement in the South. Please welcome Professor Smethurst.
Thank you. All right, so let's see if I can do this without too much. You'll have to forgive me, I'm a little bit under the weather and I'm suffering from antihistamine blurriness, so it won't, hopefully this won't be, you probably couldn't tell the difference between me and my normal state and me right now, but let's get started with this. Can everybody see this okay? Yes, okay. So I just wanted to say thanks, Krishna, and thanks to Tom Waleshko for technical help on this, and thanks to the Hutchins Institute and the Stuart Hall Foundation for their support of my project. Thanks, Skip. And thanks in advance to everybody listening to this presentation. In addition to my general blurriness, this project is in pretty early times yet. So this has sort of the ugly aspect of hearing me think out loud to some degree. So as some of you know, and as you could probably tell from Krishna's introduction, a lot of my scholarly life over the last 20 years has been devoted to the study of the Black Arts movement in the 1960s and 70s in the United States, with my most recent book being a history of the Black Arts movement in the US South. So my current project grows out of that work and moves overseas, as well as staying here to examine the connection between the US Black Arts movement and that in the United Kingdom, covering a period of from about 1960 to the 1980s. Okay, so before I start, some preliminaries. I mean, there's been a long connection and pretty well-known connection between Britain and African American literature, going back really to the very beginning of African American literature, really antedating the founding of the Republic here. From Phyllis Wheatley to Frederick Douglass to Paul Laurence Dunbar to the present, though London's importance to African American writers has not received to this point the sort of scholarly attention that, say, Paris has. There's also been a deep current of Black political and cultural radicalism, international Black political culture and cultural radicalism circulating between Britain, the Caribbean, Africa, and the United States throughout the first half of the 20th century. Some of the people, names that would be associated with this, and this is just a handful, would be people like Marcus Garvey, Claude McKay, Eric Waldron, George Padmore, Amy Ashwood Garvey, Paul Robeson, Eslanda Good Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Esther Cooper Jackson, Claudia Jones, Kwame Nkrumah, C.L.R.R. James. And this current featured to a large degree a convergence between nationalism and Marxism and Marxist parties and institutions. And it created an internationalist minded Black radicalism that marked very much the emergence of Black power and Black arts in both Britain and the United States. Though it's worth noting that the relationship between Marxism and Marxist groups and race differed quite significantly between the US and the UK. And you can ask me about, I'm not going to go into this deeply here, but you can ask me about this in the discussion if you want to, although you do so at your peril, because this is a rabbit hole that I can go down a very long way if given a chance. So this dimension did much to shape the Black arts movement and certainly to frame its legacy in the US as well as in obviously the UK. You know, as always, my work here is not intended to be in any sense definitive, but to try to open up new conversations about the international dimensions of Black arts and its legacies, and Black power and its legacies. I want to add here too that I understand the term Black, for the most part, as it's used in the United States, does not completely correlate to the way it has been historically employed in Britain to designate many non-white, especially Asian and Asian descended people. Though you might find that its usage by Black US radicals in the 1960s and 1970s was actually more like the British sense of Blackness than has often been allowed. Again, this is something we could talk about in discussion if you're interested. And also, I understand that in Britain, you know, that the notion of a Black arts movement, or at least the term Black arts movement, most often refers to a formation of the 1980s, visual arts formation, while in the United States, it is usually linked to the 1960s and 70s. So you could think of this project as addressing a long international Black arts movement, though I would also argue that the term Black arts movement, or I would insist actually, was in use in Britain as early as the 1960s, and that in many instances, the Black arts movement survived in the United States into the 1980s, especially in the US South. That was a lot of what my last book was about. So this project considers how the interplay between Black and some white radicals in Britain, the United States, Africa, and the Caribbean drew on these traditions of Black radical political and cultural circuits in the creation of Black arts in the UK. And while the impact of the model and idea of Black arts in the United States had an acknowledged, if underexplored, impact on Black arts in Britain, less attention has been paid to the role Black and white British radicals and Caribbean and African radicals who were resident for considerable times in Britain played in the rise of Black arts and the new Black literature, theater, visual arts, dance, and music of the United States, and in strengthening the internationalist consciousness and practice of US Black arts. You know, basically, you know, part of the argument is that, you know, there's been, still could be done, more could be done about British Black power and its relation to the United States, but that has been far more developed in the question of culture. Okay, so one sometimes overlooked connection between Black radicalism in Britain and in the US has to do with higher education and what might be thought of as Black colonial and immediate post-colonial circuits, which is to say that very large numbers of people from the British colonies and former colonies of Africa and the Caribbean went to historically Black colleges and universities in the United States. You know, Britain was a little different than, say, France, at least up until the 1950s, in that it tended not to try to bring its colonials, so to speak, to the UK, to its universities, to educate them in the way that the French did. They didn't try to turn them into, you know, sort of culturally British people in quite the same way that the French did at, say, the Sorbonne. There really isn't an equivalent. I mean, Skip, who, you know, you had an experience with British higher education. Weren't you like the first Black PhD in literature at Cambridge, something like that?
I was the first African American.
Okay, but pretty close. But there weren't a lot of Black people before you who got PhDs in
no,
English.
only one, an African in the 60s.
Right.
He wrote about African literature in English. And in terms of Black Americans, there was only one before me, and he was a professor at MIT. He got his in mechanical engineering. So
Right. So the point I'm making here is this would be somewhat different than the case in France. So that if you were an ambitious, intellectually, professionally ambitious person from the Caribbean, from the Anglophone Caribbean, from Anglophone or the British colonies of Africa, that you would tend to go to one of our HBCUs here in the United States if you were seeking higher education. So say someplace up until even as late as the 1960 or so, a place like Howard University, something like 35% of its student body were international students, of which I believe about 20% came from the Caribbean and about 15% came from Africa. So one thing that this meant is that African American students at HBCUs, which was a huge percentage of the Black college students at the time, were directly exposed to anti-colonial activists and ideas and what might be thought of as the Bandung world in a way that few young people in the United States were at the time of the 1950s and early 1960s. Similarly, African and Caribbean students had direct access to new currents of Black radicalism in the United States, say that of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, as well as older Black historical and cultural traditions from all over the US. Given that HBCUs were overwhelmingly located in the South and their student bodies active in the more militant aspects of the civil rights movement, African and Caribbean students were direct witnesses and in some cases participants in, although that was always risky if you're a foreign student, in mass Black struggle in the United States. The short form of this is that with the Windrush generation, named after the ship, the SS Empire Windrush that carried 500 Jamaican immigrants to London in 1948, and the movement of Caribbean and African artists and intellectuals to London in large numbers during the 1950s and 1960s, while the United States remained a center of higher education for Caribbean and African students, connections in intellectual, artistic, and political circuits were created that strengthened longstanding ties between Black radicals in the US and Britain, particularly at first in New York and London, but later beyond. Okay, so in the interest of time here, after that sort of preamble, let me, I probably could have been more user-friendly and created a timeline, but I didn't. So I'm just simply going to go through it. Let me just briefly and perhaps impressionistically mention some important events and people, some of which I'll return to later in this presentation. All right, Claudia Jones, the Trinidadian-born former leader of the Communist Party of the United States of America, who'd been deported to the UK under the McCarran Act in 1956, founds the West Indian Gazette and Afro-Asian News in 1958. A year later, she would initiate the Notting Hill Carnival in response to the so-called Notting Hill riots, racist assaults on Black people in Notting Hill, then the center of the Afro-Caribbean community in London. In 1962, at London-based Dutch national Rosie Poole would publish Beyond the Blues, an anthology of African-American poetry that links older and new traditions of Black literary radicalism. Though it was published in the UK and primarily reached a British audience, it was also important in connecting groups of Black poets in New York, Chicago, Detroit, and the US South with each other, as well as with this audience in the UK. At the same time, another Dutch national, Paul Bremen, starts his heritage series of chapbooks of Black writers, both new Black writers, you might say the avant-garde of Black writing, as well as older Black radicals like Black writers like Sterling Brown, Waring Cuney, and so forth. He does much the same as Rosie Poole. One key event in Black consciousness in Britain and the connection of the US, Black US and Black Britain is the visit of Malcolm X to Britain in 1965. Here we see him in the city of Smethwick, a small sort of deindustrializing city in Britain, in which, again, there were right-wing attacks, both physical and political, on Black residents of that city. He also makes several speeches in London during 1964 and 1965, and he speaks at the National Council of First Congress of the Council of African Organizations shortly before his murder. New Beacon Books, and then the new were founded by John LaRose and Sarah White. More about that in a minute. In 1966, and the New Beacon Bookstore in Finsbury Park, London, comes into existence in 1967. The Caribbean artist movement is started in 1966, also by John LaRose, Kamal Brathwaite, and Andrew Salke. Again, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, CAM involved not only Caribbean descended people, but also Africans and African Americans almost from the very beginning. Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture speeches in 1967 in London after he'd raised the Black Power slogan, and again in 1970 at Black Power meetings, put Black Power on the agenda of Black Britons in a new kind of way. Again, as Brathwaite notes in what I use for the title of this presentation, indicates that he created the belief that a Black international was possible. Amiri Baraka's Dutchman was first performed in London in 1967. And I might add here that Baraka's play in Britain, as in the United States, had a double life, which is to say that its initial performance was in what you might think of as an integrated bohemian setting, but its subsequent performances were often in far Blacker contexts, including the International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books. More about that book fair in a minute. Calvin Hernton performed his poetry at Caribbean Arts Movement tribute to Martin Luther King in 1968, as well as at other CAM events. Hernton was a key member of the Proto-Black Arts Umbra Poets Workshop in New York, whose members include, among other people, Ishmael Reed, David Henderson, Askia Toure, Lorenzo Thomas, Tom Den, and Steve Cannon. If these people aren't familiar to you, some of you probably know, you can ask me about it. Some of these Umbra people were not only central to the founding of the Black Arts Repertory Theater in School in Harlem, along with Amiri Baraka, but migrated across the US to California, Louisiana, Georgia, Texas, Ohio, and elsewhere, building a national Black Arts Movement network in the United States. Again, more about that in a bit. Jessica Hunt and Eric Huntley start the Black Publisher and Bookstore Bogle Literature Publications in 1969. It was started after the firing of Walter Rodney from the University of West Indies and a protest movement that emerged out of that. Though it's worth noting that the bookstore was modeled after the Drum and Spear bookstore that the Huntleys had seen in Washington, D.C. And then, I might also add that Drum and Spear in turn had been inspired by SNCC activist Charlie Cobbs and Ivanhoe Donaldson's tour of the Présence Africaine bookstore in Paris on the way home from a trip in Africa. I mean, Skip noted last week that boundaries meant something to these people, but people transgressed and crossed boundaries and drew inspiration, which is part of what this project is about, from all across Africa and its diaspora. Baraka's The Slave is performed for 2 weeks in 1972 at the Dark and Light Theater, a Black theater in South London. Race Today was founded in 1969, where discussions of US Black politics and art, including visual art and poetry and drama, took place. And also put on performances at the Keskisi Center, at the Aldrich Center, at Africa Center, and so on, all leading Black centers in the 1960s and 1970s. What I'm saying here is US poetry, US drama, US Black music, and so forth. And then, one landmark is the first International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books in 1982. First in London, but later would have satellite venues in places like Manchester and Bradford. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, the rise of the Black visual arts movement, the visual Black arts movement in the British Midlands in 1982. We'll return to this. Okay, so I've thrown all that at you, not only to make the obvious point that US Black power and Black arts exerted a considerable influence on the development and shape of Black power and Black arts in Britain, but also that as the work and actual persons of African-American artists and activists traveled to UK, particularly but not exclusively, London in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. These artists and activists gained a new sense and a more concrete sense of the international dimensions of Blackness. As I mentioned before, although the HBCUs that many of the US Black power and Black arts people, such as Baraka and Touré, had attended, had a pronounced dimension. Nevertheless, these events in Britain that they were able to attend heightened that. I might also, well, let's not. Well, I will say that it's also worth knowing that many of these Black intellectuals and artists in the United States, such as Rosa Guy, Paul Marshall, Audre Lorde, June Jordan, Kwame Ture, already had deep ties to the Caribbean. And in fact, it was pretty hard for those who grew up in the Northeast, like Tony K. Bombara, Sonia Sanchez, Jordan, Kwame Ture, not to have some connection to older generations of Caribbean American radicals, such as the bookseller Richard Moore, Cyril Briggs, Otto Huiswood, Louis Burnham, and Claudia Jones. So that what these were able to do, what these connections in Britain were able to do, it's one reason I think why Carmichael Touré was able to have such an impact in Britain, and Britain had an impact on him, as he already had this Caribbean connection. He was already able to draw on these circuits in a way that was familiar both to his listeners, his Black listeners at any rate, and also to himself, and make serve as this conduit between the US, the Caribbean, and the UK, and later Africa. And my argument is the creation of these networks, again, significantly inflected radicalism in the United States and the Caribbean and Africa from through this period. Okay, so I go into sort of the shape of the project a little bit right now, and think about it a bit. And hopefully not bore you too much. I mean, one thing I'm not going to talk about too much right now is the first chapter of this project, which is a sort of framing of the prehistory that thinks about the interplay between Black political and cultural activists in Britain and the United States during the New Negro era, and the creation of Black internationalist networks is what I call a subset of the Black Bolshevik Renaissance that will significantly inflect how things will go later on. I think the key thing that I want to emphasize about this chapter here, which I'll take up at some length, and I'll mention again later in this presentation, is that one of the things that arises out of this moment is a internationalism, a Black internationalism that decentered notions of what we might call now a Black Atlantic or a Black Atlantic world. I myself think that the idea of a Black Atlantic or an Atlantic world, though it's helped us, provided a lot of insights, is not so helpful in trying to understand what I'm talking about here. that in fact, what they did in these radicals of this period started to do, which then becomes very much a part of Black arts and Black power in the UK and the United States, was emphasizing the relation of Africa and the African diasporic communities to Asia and Asian independence movement, anticipating what a lot of US Black political and cultural radicals term the Bandung world after the African Asian Bandung Conference of 1955. And what Claudia Jones would refer to as Afro-Asian in the West Indian Gazette and Afro-Asian News. I mean, where she's intentionally complicating notions of an Atlantic world, suggesting that the most important relationship that Black people, even Black people who live in Europe, have is not, and certainly in the United States and the Caribbean, is not necessarily to Europe. Okay. So the second chapter focuses on the Black Trinidadian born and US raised communist leader Claudia Jones, who was deported from the US, ending up in Britain. And you probably know Jones best. I mean, certainly in this country, she's best known for her notion of triple oppression as a kind of forerunner, an articulator of the concept of triple oppression as a forerunner of the concept of intersectionality. But what I'm also suggesting, and this is something that I think has been somewhat underestimated, at least in US commentators on Claudia Jones, though Marika Sherwood, I think, has been the best in Britain in this way, is the way in which she brought a Black US left penchant for building Black political and cultural institutions to Britain with the West Indian Gazette, and then later the establishment of the Notting Hill Carnival, and which served as a sort of training ground for the radicals who would build the Caribbean artist movement, Race Today, the Cascade Art Center, New Beacon Books, and so on. You know, many of these people were essentially proteges or people who sort of got their early training working with Claudia Jones, or were trained by people who were trained by Claudia Jones. And I think that this institution building shaped the direction of Black British radicalism, and you know, not only Black power and Black arts, but actually the development of the Black left in the United States, conveying a much greater sense of race and racism and how that related to nation and nationality in cultural studies, as well as to such groups as the old left groups as the Communist Party and its journal Marxism Today. More about that in a bit. But I think the thing that I want to take away from this is, and this was true in the United States as well as Britain, that the nationalists, at least after the decline from the heyday of the Garvey movement, by and large did not build institutions, did not build cultural institutions in the same way that Black leftists or Black, what we might think of as left nationalists didn't. They didn't build the same journals, the same schools, the same newspapers, the same publishers, and so forth. Is that really was a penchant of the Black left more than it was the sort of straight up what we might think of as nationalists. And what people like Claudia Jones would do in the UK, like some of her peers did in the United States, is they brought this sort of penchant for institution building into nationalism, although often it was a left nationalism in a new sort of way. Here, you know, again, this is a sort of inside baseball thing, I suppose. Here in the United States, for example, even if you look at the sort of earlier Black nationalist cultural institutions and newspapers, journals, and so forth, say like the Nation of Islam's University of Islam or Muhammad Speaks, yes, they were founded and funded by the Nation of Islam, but the people who actually ran them were basically communists or ex-communists, like Christine Johnson at the University of Islam, who was probably still a Communist Party member when she was running the University of Islam. Richard Durham, Dan Burley, Joe Walker, these were all Black US leftists who were hired by the Nation of Islam, who and given considerable leeway by Elijah Muhammad, because they had the skills, but they also saw the importance of building such institutions. So I think, you know, you would, this is something that Claudia Jones brings to the UK. Third chapter talks about how Andrew Salke, Kamau Brathwaite, and the Caribbean artist movement. Again, one of the things I won't, you know, so as to give, not to go too deeply into it, but one of the things that's key in the Caribbean arts movement, besides the fact that it's sort of the first sort of major Black artists movement in Britain, under the influence of Black nationalism, under the influence of Black power, as well as Marxism and various forms of leftism, anti-colonialism in the UK, it's an interesting organization and a worthwhile. I mean, it's a very important organization, because unlike most of the groups that had preceded it in the UK, and indeed most of the groups in the United States before Black arts and Black power, it was not a writers group. It was a multimedia, multi-generic artists group. In other words, from the very beginning, it had visual artists. From the very beginning, it was involved with music. And from the very beginning, it was involved with drama and performance and so forth. And I think set that kind of pattern in the United Kingdom in a new kind of way. So it wasn't a theater, it wasn't just a bookstore, it wasn't a poets workshop, say like the Umbra Poets Workshop was in the United States. In that, it's more like, and a fairly contemporary with, maybe a year later than things like the Black Arts Repertory Theater in School, or the Organization for Black American Culture, or BOSSI, in the United States. Chapter 4 of this deals with the rise of the, well, these will jump around, goes to the rise of what we might think of as the Black publishers movement in the Great Britain, that in some ways mirrors what is going on in the United States, but I would say actually is probably more at the center of British publishing than Black arts publishing, Black power publishing, Broadside Press, Third World Press, and so on, was in the United States. It deals with people like Jessica Huntley and Eric Huntley and their founding of Bogle Literature Publications and Bookstore. Again, partly to publish Walter Rodney, but also a wide range of Black writers, so that they would publish Walter, they'd be the first really to publish How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, but they were also the first to publish the poet and performance artist Linton Kwesi Johnson. Similarly, John LaRose, who is here, we see him with, to the left of Kamau Brathwaite, at a Caribbean artist movement event, would start with his partner Sarah White, would start New Beacon Books, and later New Beacon Bookstore in Finsbury Park. And they too would become, you know, incredibly important in not only bringing Black books, Black writing, promoting Black literature and Black scholarship to a British public, but they were also, as I think Skip, and I'll end on this today, Skip mentioned, they were a few, you know, at the very beginning, very important in terms of bringing a sort of international Black consciousness to Black arts in the United States. I mean, we had Black bookstores here, Louis Michaud's bookstore, Richard Moore's bookstore, Vaughn's bookstore in Detroit, which that sort of thing, but that, Drum and Spear in Washington, D.C. But these were bookstores that were even more international than the Black bookstores in the United States. Another important thing is the founding of the journal Race Today by Darkis Howe, Layla Hassan, and a collective that would also eventually include Linton Kwesi Johnson. And then, in 1982, a sort of alliance of New Beacon Books and Bookstore, Bogolovichur, and Race Today would begin the International Black Book Fair of Black and Third World books. And let me just say here, I got this one moment thing. What is the one moment thing? I can't. Is there a problem here? I can't see it. Okay. Well, I'll just go forward. And the thing, this was an incredibly important, and this is going to be a large portion of this chapter, of sort of crystallizing what we might think of as the Black International. Just to give you a sense of who all appeared at these things, in no particular order of alphabetization or importance. Just take a look for a minute at the people who appeared at these book fairs over the years. Jane Cortez appeared 3 times. Amiri Baraka and Sonia Sanchez appeared twice. So these are the US folks. I believe the great pianist and composer Randy Weston performed at least twice, maybe 3 times at these festivals that ran from 1982 to 1985. I think I also said that there was one performance that involved Kamau Brathwaite, Amiri Baraka, and Linton Kwesi Johnson. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for that. Perhaps, I don't know if there's anybody of the British people who are on this call who actually got to see that performance. That would have been, one of those dream things that I can only dream about. But what I'm interested in here is just to think about this and think about what it would mean to be at an event like this. And this is only a very small subset of all the people who were there. These are just some that I thought people might find interesting. But that in a way, maybe not in scale and in elaborateness, but this is like Festac, the Festival of African Culture, or the great festivals in Senegal, or in Nigeria, or SIXPAC, the Sixth Pan-African Conference in Nigeria. These are like that every year in London, in Manchester, in Bradford. That you could walk around and you could talk to Wally Soyinka, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Jane Cortez, Amiri Baraka, Sonia Sanchez, Linton Kwesi Johnson, and so forth. In other words, some of the greatest writers and most productive writers of North America, of the Caribbean, of Africa, and South Asia, actually, at this, as well as the Black British writers who had come to be really at the forefront of British writing in the coming period. People like a young Carol Phillips, for example, a young Paul Gilroy. Okay, So you would get to see this here. The final chapter of this project thinks about the Black Arts Group of the 1980s, and which is what is most often referred to by the term the Black Arts movement in Britain. Now, this is really a very interesting phenomenon because one of the striking things about the Black Art Group and the Black Arts movement of the 1980s is that its initial circle was what we might call provincial in British sense. I don't mean that in a pejorative term, but I mean in the sense that the group first came together in Wolverhampton, with many of its initial participants born or raised in the Midlands and industrial Midlands and north of England, principally Manchester, Birmingham, Nottingham, Coventry, and Wolverhampton, not London and environs. So, you know, this group is no doubt influenced by these earlier sites of Black radicalism that were primarily centered or heavily centered in London, New Beacon, Kaskade, Africa Center, Race Today, and so forth, as well as to US Black radicals. But this was a different kind of group in some kind of ways. They had connections and a different kind of feel. And that's, you know, that these artists were people who, for the most part, were born and grew up in England or had come to Britain at a very early age. They did not think of themselves as their elders did often as Afro-Caribbeans or as Caribbeans. This is when the term Black British really comes into its own. They had gone to British schools, including universities that were often the red brick or civic universities, you know, that were designed sort of to serve the working class in the Midlands and the north of England. And so for them, Black still had an internationalist meaning, still had internationalist meanings, African diasporan, including Caribbean, as well as a local meaning, but that they were very much tied to sort of local Black culture. This is a picture of a disco in Wolverhampton at roughly that time. A Midlands musical and Northern musical culture that was flourishing. Bands like Steel Pulse, the Specials, and the Beat, a culture that was what I would call politicized Black music, though with some significantly interracial elements, and a culture that I would include in my larger schema of the Black arts movement. Again, this is, or not again, but that one significant aspect of the Black arts movement in the UK is that, at least for a time, it significantly decentered cultural production in Britain, much as Black arts did in the United States. That is not to say that London, like New York in the US, did not still have a disproportionate presence in British and Black British arts and culture, but that the center of gravity nevertheless did shift to a considerable degree. Just like Black arts in the United States placed Newark Central Ward, Pittsburgh's Hill and Homewood, Lorain, Ohio, New Orleans, Treme, Jackson Ferris Street, and West Oakland into what we might call the US cultural imaginary. So did Manchester's Moss Side, Liverpool's Toxteth, Birmingham's Handsworth join London's Brixton and Notting Hill in UK culture via Black arts. Okay, so as a British author in a pretty well-known novel had a character say, "I've delighted you long enough." But to conclude, I just want to say a few things. I mean, not only did these institutions help circulate text, images, sounds, recordings, and ideas, But they also, again, created spaces where African-American artists and activists could forge networks with people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Wally Senyca, Amara Adu, Brathwaite, Johnson, and so on. You know, again, where one could meet the leading artists of Africa and its diaspora on a regular basis, artists who one might otherwise only encounter once a decade, if then, at international events like Festac in Nigeria or the Sixth Pan-African Congress Conference in Tanzania. Now, you know, here in the United States, given how many major African, Black, British, and Caribbean writers now have or have recently had places either on a permanent or visiting basis in the US Academy, it's hard to remember how inaccessible most African, Caribbean, Black, British, and even African American texts, art, and artists were in the US in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. So briefly, this is where John LaRose, Sarah White, the Huntleys, New Beacon Bookstore, New Beacon Press, Bogle Louverture, Race Today, Africa Center, the International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books, and so on, come in. They not only introduced young Black British artists such as Linton Kwesi Johnson to the work of Amiri Baraka and other US Black arts writers, and indeed the African American literary tradition, but they were also international as well as internationalist institutions that made the crossroads of Africa, Europe, and the Americas that Britain was in the 1970s and 1980s, available to African American artists and activists, indeed to US scholars of Black culture from a wide range of backgrounds, and forged links between Black artists, intellectuals, and cultural organizers around the world to a significant extent, making real the Black International of which Kamau Brathwaite wrote. So speaking, you know, as I am for myself, I can remember landing at New Beacon Books in Finsbury Park as a young person in the 1980s, one who really had no idea of a life in the academy, and being amazed not only at the availability of hitherto unheard of or only heard of but never seen books by African, Black, British, and Caribbean writers, and by texts by US Black writers that one could not find in US bookstores. I recall picking up a copy of Claude McKay's Banjo that I still have to this day. And that book actually has a place in this project. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was great. It brought back a lot of memories. I used to hang out at New Beacon Books. When I was a student at Cambridge, I worked at Time Magazine in Smethurst and during the holidays. And I would just take the corporate taxi, black taxi, it's called a radio taxi. And I would go up there to Finsbury Park because it was so out of the way and just keep it waiting for an hour and then buy 200 pounds of books. Man, they loved it when I came.
Yeah, they're still there. You know, there was a scare for a while, but they're still hanging in there.
My question is, if I may, Krishna, what happened to this movement? I mean, you're right that we think of the Black British cultural movement as centered around Stuart Hall in the 80s and, you know, the early 90s. And one of the curious things about it, at least for an African American, is that they weren't too crazy about using the word Black. You know, they did in some ways, like autograph, ABP, Black, and then Black Photographers, you know, group. But they very much liked the word international and diverse, and Stewart was very big on Indians and Asians being called Black. He was internationalizing the concept of Blackness. He had how would I put it? An inherent, implicit reaction against anything that smacked of essentializing Blackness, right? And his way of doing that was to redefine the word Blackness away from the way that we define the word Blackness. And then, first of all, what was the relationship to the 60s movement that you've so beautifully described to the movement in the late 80s, right? And what were their, compare and contrast them, as we'd say to a student on an exam. And what's their legacy today?
Okay, maybe I'd fail that exam. That's a complicated question. I mean, the notion of Black in Britain, you know, I guess speaking as an outsider, I mean, there was always a sense that, or not always, but long a sense that Black in Britain encompassed more than people of African descent. I mean, in this period, particularly people from South Asia and East Asia, I would say that there was always this sort of notion of Blackness. Though I would say in Britain now and for some time, Black in Britain means something more like, for the most part, like Black does in the United States, which is to say people of African descent, is my observation, you know, just and it less so in that time. But I think so. So that, you know, that's, well, and I think one of the things that one has to come to grips with talking about the United States and talking about Britain, that and one of the things which they struggled with at the time in terms of translating US Black politics, culture, notions, concepts to the British environment, and then for people here thinking about Britain, is that, you know, the communities were quite different in some respects. I mean, obviously there's been a Black presence in Britain going back to the Roman Empire, right? I mean, it's a long time. I mean, people who we would call ocularly Black have been in Britain for a very long time. But the Black community that we're talking about, you know, the basic group of the bedrock community is Afro-Caribbean, and they're immigrants who have mostly come from, I mean, what was it, 48 was the SS Windrush, who basically came in the 50s and 60s, joined by large numbers of people of South Asian descent from South Asia and from Africa, and the Caribbean, actually. And so you have Black Guyanese, and you have, as we would understand it, and South Asian descended Guyanese, for example, there in the UK. So, and that a lot of people who talk about the evolution of the Black community in Britain talk about the sort of psychological evolution of many people from considering themselves as being British and being disabused of that once they actually arrived in Britain, and white British people considered them to be, and treated them and described them as non-white foreigners. And then to West Indian, to Caribbean, and then Black, I think, begins to change, you know, really come into a new kind of usage in the 80s, which I'm going to take up in the final portion, because people aren't from the Caribbean anymore. A lot of them aren't. They're born and raised in Wolverhampton, or, you know, Birmingham, or Glasgow, or London, or Bristol, or wherever. And it's, you know, so Anne, you must have, you know, something of this when you're dealing with France, right? The difference between the immigrant generations and the their children and grandchildren. It's not that they don't reject the connection to the Caribbean. The other thing, and it's like this, you know, so I think, Skip, if this, it's by nature, you know, the Black arts people here were internationalists too. But there, and I think that's something people learned a lot from there, you had to be an internationalist because people were immigrants. And if you're talking about the artists, and increasingly the population as time goes on, where you start to have larger and larger numbers of Africans immigrating to the UK, you know, Afro-Caribbean didn't get it entirely, right? And it was a contradiction at the beginning, right? Because in the Caribbean artist movement, you had guys like Calvin Hurton from the United States and various African descended, African born people, Ngugi wa Thiong'o and so forth, who are floating around there also. And they're not even a little bit Caribbean, except in, you know, the African, the Black connection. I don't know if this is helping. So I think, you know, they, you know, they in Britain, they themselves go through certain kinds of things, and they, and I think they're very careful about certain kinds of essentialism, although they, you know, they're trying, you know, it's, I mean, you know, you're from, I mean, this was true here too, though. I mean, not to go back to, you know, think about the signifying monkey. I mean, I don't want to say was in your head, but I mean, you're trying to figure out, well, what is a Black vernacular tradition in literature? What does that mean in a modern sense, without being too too essentialist, or as the deconstructionists might say, too metaphysical, right? You know, what does that, and they're trying to think about, well, what does Black mean? And I think that they're also insisting on an internationalist thing. So I don't know if this, the last thing I will say though, is that, you know, here, if you're talking about this real hardcore Black power, Black arts activists, there are a lot of, they would include in Black, you know, much like Elijah Muhammad did when he's talking about the Afro-Asiatic man, a lot of people who we wouldn't consider Black normally, like Palestinians. The idea that Palestine is actually part of Africa. So that, you know, one of the first anthology, you know, magazine, journal collections of Palestinian poetry is in Journal of Black Poetry. Drum and Spear Press publishes the first anthology of Palestinian poetry. Part of it was what they saw as political solidarity, but some of the people would go so far as to claim that someone like Darwish, Mahmoud Darwish, or those people were Black, even though visibly you wouldn't go there. Does that answer your question? I mean, I know it's one of my people, you know, one of my Smethurstian, as my students like to say, sort of roundabout answers. I mean, the other thing is, when you're talking about, the last thing I'll say, because this is something I'm going to take up, I mean, Stuart Hall changes a lot in these times, as cultural studies does, right? Where they go, despite subculture, despite the, you know, people looking at Rastafarians and so forth, race is not, in the early days of Birmingham, is not such a big thing, you know, despite the fact that you could say that Stuart Hall was a educational member, you know, higher educational member of the Windrush generation. He changes quite a bit, so that in some ways he converges much more with Black power by the 70s, late 70s, than he would be earlier.
Great answer. And you're right, Stewart never would have been caught dead talking about race at the very beginning in Birmingham, right? And then he becomes the center of this cultural movement. But I didn't get the feeling that he brought many of the people whom you mentioned and whom we just saw in your wonderful presentation along with him, you know, in the movement from the late 80s. I see it more as a break. And is that fair or not? I mean, do you think that Stewart thought himself as continuing that, or as starting over again and redefining?
Well, you know, I'm a little, with seeing Gregor McLennan here and some folks like that, I'm a little bit nervous about generalizing too much about Stuart Hall. I mean, I never met him, you know, I've read him, obviously. But my understanding is, well, first of all, Stuart Hall was a complicated guy, and his relationship to Black culture and ideas of Black culture were always, I think, very complicated. You know, and but you know, because on one hand he would criticize cultural studies, and they're later in his career, including himself, one has to say in all fairness, for its relationship to race in Great Britain. But at the same time, there's that famous line he says about popular culture that if, other than sort of the political, if it's not doing that kind of political work, or other than the political work is something, someone here who's better memory than me can probably quote it, I don't give a damn, something to that effect. I think that's a fair assessment of what he actually said. But we know, from reading about, from what I know of his biography, when he was a young man and in Britain, and he was what we might call not a contemporary kind of hipster, but hipster as it would have been understood in the 1950s, jazz, that kind of Black culture. He was very much engaged with that. So I have to say, I don't believe him when he says he doesn't give a damn about popular culture and Black music and Black culture, because I think he was very attached to it, so he's one of these complicated people, like say Amiri Baraka in a different kind of way, where, you have to be careful about what he said at a certain moment in a certain context. So I think, he had an ambivalent engagement with Black arts and Black power in the UK, but I think he was very much a part of that thing. That's one of the things, as you can tell, I haven't worked this out. I said early times yet. It's one of the things I'm going to be thinking about is what is the relation of this to cultural studies and where cultural studies went. Who wants to?
That's a good answer. My question is only, is it phase one and phase two of the same movement? Does it morph, or does Stewart see himself as, Stewart was very modest and it was very sincere. So, but is Black British cultural studies a continuation of what was happening in the late 60s and early 70s? Or did it see itself as a break, something fresh and new, a departure? That's my feeling. Without, he knew John LaRose, they were all friends. I'm not talking about that. But when you think of the great figures of Black British cultural studies in, Isaac Julian and Paul Gilroy and Stewart, you don't think of any of those names. Correct me if I'm wrong, anyone in the seminar, but I'm not thinking of those people that he brought along from the 60s and early 70s, that he brought along with him and who arose as major figures in the late 80s and early 90s. Now, and I could be wrong, but I just can't think of it. They all still bought their books at New Beacon Books.
Well, yeah, I think it's a continuation, but a continuation under different circumstances by different people. Why? But and why would Isaac Julian make a movie like Looking for Langston if he isn't thinking about these kinds of connections? I think Paul Gilroy
Yeah, but nobody would have made that movie in the Black arts movement. They would have been run out of town, talking about gay people. The Black arts movement in America was homophobic big time.
Well, Skip, that's a discussion we can have. I think yes and no, but it depended on who you were talking about. The trouble is talking about Black art. Okay, because I know that people have had their hands up for a while, but I was just saying, trouble talking about Black arts here and Black arts there. There's no Pope of Black arts. There's no chairman. There's none of that stuff. So it's a very decentralized movement. It's a very or a formation, if you prefer. It's very complicated. That I often, it's a conversation that is often a debate. So it depends on who you're talking about. I think it's pretty variable, and people. And things had changed by the 1980s. The last thing I'll say about this, though, is that when you get into the 80s, especially after the early Black arts, visual arts thing in the early 80s, and you're in the hardcore age of Thatcherism and Reagan, people have a very different, things look a lot different than they looked in the 1970s, even, both here and there. All right.
So your final, Chris is kicking me under the table, telling me to shut up. But my final question is, So your project will encompass the, both movements, as it were.
Oh
Stuart's
yeah,
movement. Stewart was the Pope. He just didn't accept the crown.
yeah, sure, Skip. Well, I mean, as they used to say back in the deconstruction days, we're going to be talking about ruptures as well as continuities, or disjunctures as well as continuities.
Beautiful.
Krishna, do you want to? Shall I modify? Shall I call on people, or why don't you? You're probably keeping track of who was first, right?
Yes, it's kind of self-evident in the program, but Professor McLennan, would you like to comment or ask a question?
Well, colleagues, friends, I'm really delighted to be part of this and to thank James for his presentation. And Krishna, I've corresponded with you loads of times, but I think this is the first time we've been physically visual. So I'm a professor of sociology at Bristol University in England, and I'm chair of the academic committee of the Stuart Hall Foundation, with which we have, of course, this intimate relationship with yourselves that produces this kind of seminar, and Professor Gates and others. We're all so grateful that we're part of this. And we've actually got Peter, who's blanked himself out now, Peter Hume, who was a Harvard Stuart Hall Fellow a couple of years ago. So just number one, thanks very much for this forum and this discussion. And James was good enough, prestigious though he is, to participate last week in a fairly humble Stuart Hall Fellow Scholar seminar a couple of weeks ago, because we bring in junior people, just brand new PhD scholars and so on. So thank you for this, and now you've heard who I am. Getting on to the substance of it, I do have a couple of questions and a couple of comments. To James, I was just wondering, I mean, I'm a social theorist rather than a historian, and I just couldn't quite work out what the punchline of your presentation was. So that's just a question. If you just tell me, punchlines are out, narratives are in, terrific, I'll take that. Secondly, but there's a few things about British cultural studies and Stewart that have been raised. I went to school with Linton Johnson, and we were just 2 of 3 of the highest level multicultural 2,000 kids, boys, wild school in Brixton. And there were only, he and I were 2 of 3 who then, who were educated through great A-level, that's the top school qualification, economics, believe it or not, degree qualification by a rampant, smelly, dope smoking Trotskyist who was way to the left of both of us. So I kind of, and Stuart and the rest of Birmingham, we kind of danced to Steel Pulse and so on. So, all your talk just all those things for me. Smethwick, by the way, not Smethwick. That's a bit of
Sorry. Yeah. I'm despite my name and the fact that my great grandfather was from Oldham, I'm resolutely a New Jersey boy, so you got to forgive me.
Anyway, that's terrific. Just one thing, and it's more important to me now. I was a student of Stewart. We were colleagues for years together, and I've just produced, maybe you know, maybe you don't, doesn't matter, the Stuart Hall on Marxism, Duke UP selection. And it really does bring back to me as more or less a kid, you know, just out of my BA, going to the Birmingham school, and Stewart himself was only 42 years old or something. And you know, we project back into those times. Oh, Stewart must have thought this, Stewart must have thought that. I'm not so sure, you know, we were all just muddling along, and the Birmingham thing is now ludicrously iconic because we were all just arguing our heads off most of the time. So the ways in which we talk about, oh, Stewart thought this and Stewart thought that, sorry to contradict you, James, but a really historical perspective puts that in context. It was just a kind of exploratory happenstance, institutionally complex development. For whatever reason, fascinating reasons, has suddenly become the condition on which we can have this conversation. Enough, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gregor. Yeah, I tend to go by Jim, by the way. I completely agree with you about, I mean, I remember reading, well, first of all, I mean, and you said it perhaps more articulately than I did as far as Stuart Hall goes, when I said he's a complicated or contradictory guy, as I think it's very hard sometimes to pin down, you know, I mean, you can pin down what he wrote at a particular moment in a particular place, but I think his views, what I was trying to say is his views and his evolution were complicated. And so I agree. And I do remember reading somewhere where he said that what he, sort of along the lines of what you were saying, that what he remembers most about Birmingham was arguing. So that it wasn't like there was any kind, again, as I was trying to say, that there's, I mean, there are figures who have certain stature, like say Stuart Hall had in cultural studies, or, you know, for that matter, here in the United States, someone like Amiri Baraka had in Black arts, but that it nevertheless, they weren't Pope, you know, they weren't infallible, that the, you know, that there, it was conversations, it was arguments, it was criticism, it was debates, and so forth. So I completely agree with you there, and that's one of the things I'm trying to figure out. Going back to, I think, your initial, you know, and with relative to the topic that I'm dealing with, going back to your initial comment, question, I don't know that I have, I mean, my narrative, which I tried to say, it's not so much a narrative as a sort of assumption that I've come based on some studies, some interviewing, some thinking, is the importance of the British Black power and Black arts, as I define it, to you know, its influence on U.S. Black arts and Black power. It's the way in which it made a sense of Black internationalism, which to some degree was theoretical here at the time, outside of maybe some historically Black universities and a few other places, palpable, made it real. That's I think an important contribution, that I think that too often when we talk about Black power and Black arts, it's thinking about the influence of the United States on the UK, Black cultural activists and artists on the Black their peers in the UK. And I'm arguing that this actually was a influence that went two ways, or actually multiple ways, since inevitably when you talk about the United States and the UK, you end up talking about Africa, the Caribbean, to some degree, Canada in this. And so that's probably about as much as a narrative as I've got right now. I mean, I have some sort of sub-narratives, like about Claudia Jones, who I have to admit that part of the project is probably more developed than some of the other parts. But you know, I'm trying not to trying to push a narrative too much at this point because I don't know enough. I haven't done the work. I'm hoping that if this COVID stuff declines and I get my booster shot, and that sometime probably in the spring, I'm going to get over to the UK and be able to get back into the archives over there, talk to some people and get a better sense of what I'm talking about. Because you know, I don't want to end up coming up with narratives that then you end up sort of jamming a square peg into a round hole. You know, I mean, I have some ideas, but I'm sort of hoping the evidence will take me to more of a narrative. I mean, that's sort of been my experience with dealing with the Black Arts movement in the United States, which, like in Britain, is a real hairball, right? I mean, it's extraordinarily geographically, historically, ideologically, aesthetically complicated and contradictory movement. So one has to be very, very careful about narratives. If does that answer your questions, I hope. And thank you so much for coming too. It's real. I mean, I actually had fun at that meeting. So it's interesting to see what people are doing. It's also interesting to see people who knew, or in one case was actually married to Stuart Hall, as opposed to, you know, me sitting at my desk here reading books or whatnot, looking at YouTube videos.
Yes, thank you for joining us, and we hope that you will join us again. You would be most welcome.
Kate.
Hi, Jim. Thank you for this presentation. I learned so much. I wanted to ask you a couple questions. So pick the one you want to respond to and reject the rest. Okay, so as an Africanist, I was thinking a lot about what you said about kind of the education of Africans in the UK versus the US. And as an historian and archaeologist, I was kind of thinking, oh, well, it seems to me like there were a lot. And I wondered if that was sort of discipline specific, because a lot of the historians and archaeologists that end up taking up positions in national museums boards and these sorts of things are educated in the UK or, you know, certainly in France, as you mentioned, but in the UK too. I was also curious that you had this offhand comment that was so interesting to me about how the emergence of bookstores and presses in the UK was closer to the center of the publishing world. And I wondered if you might riff on that for a few minutes. You kind of said that it was less marginalized than in the US. Or maybe I misheard you or misread you. You look like you're trying to remember if you actually said that.
No, I did say it.
And I was wondering about that, if you could tell us why you thought that was the case. What was it about the context of the publishing world in the UK that was different? I'm thinking about the way in which this was a moment in time when a lot of sort of dictionaries and ethnographies are being reprinted, that there's this sort of circulation in other domains as well, and wondering about the role of those in the sort of centering of Black presses as opposed to you know, what might be more about the sort of context specific to the UK. And then, well, I don't know, you invited a question about kind of the notion of race and Marxism. And I thought I would punt that to you if you wanted to riff a little bit about it, because I was interested to hear what you had to say. But the other two questions are ones that really piqued my interest. So thank you again for this.
What's the first one again?
Yeah,
Kate?
my first one was about whether it was discipline specific, this idea of a sort of limited flow from the continent of Africa to the UK, especially for PhDs, because in history and in archaeology, it seems to me that at this moment in time, there are a lot of scholars going and training in the UK, but it might be about the disciplines that touch on my field.
Well, I don't, again, this might be something I don't know enough about, but my sense is that now it begins to change in the 50s, right? I mean, Stuart Hall himself is somebody who comes from Jamaica to study find a place in British universities. I think Ngugi wa Thiong'o went to Leeds, University in Leeds, I believe.
No, Soyinka went to Leeds.
Okay, but I think where did Googie go? He went to someplace in Britain, I think.
I don't know. I'll Google it.
I thought maybe it's Shoyinka, but so there were some people who did that. But what I'm saying is, certainly before the 50s, it was less common. I mean, you don't really have a British equivalent to negritude. And if you think about who are the negritude people, the negritude people are basically, a lot of them are Black artists, intellectuals, political folks who are in France to study at French universities, and because the French have brought them, there, basically. Now, it didn't work out for the French quite the way they thought it would, although, there is some argument about, say, Senghor's attitude versus some other people's attitudes and the negritude attitude. But, I don't want to get into that. So I think by the 50s, things are beginning to change. But I think and then it really changes by the time you get into the late 70s, into the 80s, where you have whole groups of Black British folks who were born or at least grown up in the UK, who went to university, mostly a lot of them in the Midlands again. But so, I need to do more. I mean, publishing, that's kind of an offhand thing. It seems to me that Bogle, Louverture, New Beacon, and certainly Allison Busby imprint, they feel like to me, and I'd have to, you'd have to run the numbers. They feel like to me that they had a higher profile. Heinemann's, and then African stuff. They had a higher profile in the UK for reasons that we could speculate about, but I'd have to think about more than, say, Broadside Books, Third World Books, Journal of Black Poetry Press, and those presses had here. Now, having said that, I don't know that they're more important. I mean, things like Broadside Press had a huge circulation in the United States in Black communities. They put something like 500,000 volumes of poetry, not individual titles, but 500,000 volumes of poetry in print over a period of 10 years. I mean, if you know anything about the way poetry works in the United States, that's unbelievable for a small press. They published more titles in 10 years by poets than way more, multiples more than all the presses in the United States had in the 10 years preceding Broadside's founding. So they're clearly, I'm not saying that the British ones are more important. I'm just saying, I mean, the New York Times, I don't think ever, I'm not sure they ever, reviewed a book by Broadside Press.
So they were more mainstream.
Ngugi studied at Makerere in Kampala, and Achebe studied at Ibadan. It was a big deal when Shoyinka went to Leeds.
So thanks for the correction. I was wrong about that. For some reason, I thought Ngugi had some connection to Leeds, but I could be wrong about. I mean, I'm definitely probably wrong about that. That was one of those offhand remarks. Okay, so but I have more to think about it. As far as Marxism goes, it's a long. I don't think you want to hear all of this at this point, but I mean, it's worth knowing. I mean, I think the short form of it is that if you think about Marxism in the African American community in the United States, I mean, as vis-a-vis Black community in Britain, is really what it comes down to is, for better and for worse, for a long time in the United States, with respect to Marxism, the Communist Party of the United States was the 800-pound gorilla. It had to do with their putting the Black liberation in various forms, but basically Black liberation, Black civil rights, and so forth, right at the center of their work. It's a long and complicated story, and which is something that remains throughout the history of the Communist Party, you know, and how you think of what they did, how they dealt with it, how honest they were, and so forth, including, you know, Black leaders of the Communist Party, like Claudia Jones, who was probably not only one of the leading Black members of the Communist Party, probably second only to Benjamin Davis, and by the 1950 or something, she was probably the head leading person in terms of women's issues in the party at that time. So, but anyhow, you have that here, and that if you look at, as I did in my first book, look at Black writers of the 1930s and 40s, there's practically no one that you can name other than Zora Neale Hurston, and she herself is complex in this way, who did not have some significant connection to the Communist Party in one way or another. I mean, nobody that you've ever heard of. Now, they didn't all stay there. Most of them didn't. But I'm just saying that that's okay. So the British Communist Party is a very different kettle of fish. That kind of racist and analytic was not that anti-colonialism, yes, at certain points, but it was not central to the DNA of the Communist Party in Great Britain the way it was to the US Communist Party after the late 1920s. So, for example, Claudia Jones, who'd been one of the top people in the party here in the United States, had a very contentious relationship with Harry Pollitt and the British Communist Party. Very contentious. Really. And you know, anyway, so that it's different. Now that will change. I mean, one thing that what we're talking about today is that not only did the Black Power and Black Arts change the new left that emerged from the crisis of 1956 and the Khrushchev's speech about Stalin and all that, this what we might think of as the Stalin crisis and the invasion of Hungary crisis of 1956. But you know, they did a lot to put the left, put race and Black liberation, you know, in a broad sense, at the center of the new left, and even some of the old left. So if you look at the British Communist Party's Marxism Today, which was an important political and cultural journal of the 70s into the 80s, I mean, and without getting into complicated British sort of sectarian, you know, fights on the left and divisions on the left, that changes because of Black arts and Black power. So does that's probably, you see, I warned you about asking me that question. That's probably more than you know, so that in the short form is, so you have lots of Black Marxists, you know, I mean, most of the Black radical leaders, intellectuals, artists, I mean, they're influenced by Marxism to one degree or another, but it's not, you couldn't write The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual in Britain. There would be no Harold Cruse in Britain the way he was in the United States, which is basically an attack on that old political and cultural world of the Communist Party, because they simply didn't have that kind of influence that they did here. Okay, there you go. Now, aren't you sorry?
We're not sorry, thank you. And Selene? You're muted, thank you.
Thank you very much, James, for your presentation. I learned a lot. It was very interesting. It also opened some questions for my own research. I have a question that is very related with what you began to say about the political aims of those connections and solidarities between Black intellectuals and Black artists. I was wondering in which way those connections, those solidarities went over the demarginalization of Black artists and Black writers, and in which way those persons shared the same political visions of empire, racism, of capitalism, and in some way, to what extent some shared the same visions, and in the contrary, to what extent they did not have the same conception of Black radicalism. I guess that not all of them were Marxist, though
Right.
there were a lot of Marxists. I had this question because when I was very young, at 19, when I arrived to Paris, I attended a conference at La Sorbonne with Glissant and Soyinka. And at this moment, they discussed about the meaning of diaspora. And I understood that they didn't have the same vision, and that maybe that Soyinka had a broad vision of Pan-Africanism than Glissant. And in some way, I was wondering in which way those very different heterogeneous visions of Blackness and of politics in a strong meaning had an influence on those connections and solidarities. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. You know, it's funny you should ask that, because I was thinking during, and I couldn't get it into a coherent question. It's hard for me to even think of coherent answers, but you know, I'm maybe not that coherent a person, but that I thought a lot about that when you were giving your talk also. You know, I was going to ask you a similar question about thinking about France and the connections between, say, across the English Channel between Black Britons and French. And obviously there are some, but amongst these people, you know, there are quite different people. You know, first of all, they're from different places. They have different experiences. Marxism, even people who are Marxist to one degree or another have various, and I don't know that Soyinka was ever, I mean, he's obviously conversant with Marxism. I'm not sure that he was a Marxist ever. I mean,
Never.
Yeah.
Never.
So he was, say, very different than Gugi Batiango, for example, in that kind of way. Or Linton Kwesi Johnson, for that matter. I think I guess what I'm going to say is I think it's variable. Or someone like Stuart Hall, who has a very, you know, I've said the word complicated a lot with him, but he does have a complex relationship to Marxism. I mean, partly because of his history. And again, Gregor will know better than I will, you know, sort of the details of it. But, you know, that he becomes part of this sort of new left that in part is moves away from a certain kind of Marxism, what we might call Third International Marxism, the Communist Party's historians group, and also on the cultural side, someone like Raymond Williams, who move away from what they think of as sort of the Stalinized Marxism, if you will. I mean, some of them, like Hobsbawm, stay in the Communist Party with reservations. Most of the others leave, and he becomes part of this sort of new left, as he says that Marxism is their starting point, but in some ways it's a starting point that they move away from, and you know, even as it's their starting point. But then, you know, then you have the third world Marxism of the 1960s and 1970s, which brings Marxism back into it, and people like Williams and Hall, to one degree or another, sort of come back. I don't know exactly how you would describe their ideology, but come back in many ways to Marxism, but a different Marxism than the one that they left. So I think, you know, talking about people's views is pretty difficult. I think that basically what I would say is people are trying to find are arguing a lot, as Gregor said. I mean, not just in Birmingham, but in general, they're arguing a lot and discussing a lot, but they're arguing around shared interests and shared questions of nation, of ethnicity, of culture, language, self-determination. What does self-determination mean in a national sense of like self-determination here in the United States or in the Caribbean or in Africa, but also in an internationalist sense across national boundaries. I mean, that may sound kind of weird, you know, the idea of nationalism across nations, but that's what they're trying to think about. And I think, you know, so the way I would put it with these, and how does one make that real? How does one manifest it? You know, not just both in terms of actual states, you know, actual countries, actual polities. How does one make it manifest in terms of culture, in terms of art, and so forth? And you know, I think they, you know, I don't think there was any, you know, they never came to a decision, right? I mean, I think that's one of the things that Gregor was asking, what is the narrative? I think part of the problem is that, you know, the narrative remained unfinished, necessarily unfinished, I think. I don't want to get to like all postmodernism and modernist and, you know, indeterminacy and hybridity and so forth. I mean, you can go too far, but I mean, there is a sense in which they're talking about these things and also thinking about in the different political moments. You know, it's very different in Britain under Labour. I guess, what would you call it? Old Labour? I mean, or what have you, vis-a-vis under Thatcher. Just like it's different here under Carter than it is, or under Nixon or under Johnson than it is under Reagan. It's just, you know, so I don't know how helpful this is. And, you know, and one thing also that I think that's really important, and we see this in different ways, and again, not to put thoughts, you know, to speak for you, but say something like the signifying monkey, for example, in the you know, is to think about this, how does one come to grips with some notion of Black culture, Black popular culture in all its complexity, and link it without too much romance, without too much metaphysics, without too much essentialism, to some overall notion of, I don't know, to sound corny, possibly liberation, freedom. You know, how does one do this? What is the culture? And I think the different people came up with different answers that are in some ways are related, you know, in the sense they're trying to answer this same question. So you get somebody like Walter Rodney, who, you know, what really got him fired from the University of the West Indies at Mona was his attempt to, both on an intellectual level as well as on an activist level, try to conjoin Marxism and Rastafarianism and Rastafarian culture, you know, reggae included, not only intellectually but in real life, you know, trying to think about how would that work on the ground in Jamaica. And the authorities there saw that as way dangerous, way more dangerous than just thinking intellectually about Marxism or what have you. I mean, I think Kamal Braithwaite tries to do something similar in his work. Certainly someone like Linton Kwesi Johnson is thinking about, you know, very, you know, thinking about these politics, analysis, music, you know, the popular music. And, you know, I think that, you know, the question is, how does one relate to this? What is the relationship? You know, I have a whole spiel I can do on the relationship between, say, hip hop and the rise of consciousness rap, and you know, we heard about this already, sound systems. You know, we got some of that already, and in New York and in London, and all the circulation of, you know, what we might think of as politically radical, anti-colonial Rastafarianism, radical Black British dub poetry, and hip hop here. I mean, and I, I guess what I'm saying here is that we have to be, again, careful about the square peg in the round hole kind of thing. Is I don't think you're gonna, my short form is I don't think you're gonna find a single shared belief. There's no way.
Just a quick footnote. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Go ahead. Somebody's gotta.
No. Ironically, and we could keep going because I see other hands up. Because I find this riveting. The signifying monkey starts with Black British, well, let's call it Anglo-African tradition.
Yes.
The trope of the talking book, all those guys published their books in England, most of them, at the very beginning, these slave narratives. Grania Equiano, Cugoano, Phyllis Wheatley, they were all Anglo-Africans, right? And then the trope comes back 3,000 miles to New York and Boston and Philadelphia, and then unfolds for 200 years. I could not have written a signifying monkey about Black British writing because we didn't have that 200-year continuous tradition of people reading each other, echoing each other, revising each other, troping on each other in the same way. Perhaps it could have been done, but with a hell of a lot less text than we. But I tried to emphasize what people often forget, that it starts with Black Britain. These are Black British writers. These are Anglo-African. Phyllis Wheatley is the mother of the African-American tradition, but she's also the mother of Black British.
Yes. Well, that's what I'm trying to say is that, I'm looking at you got to draw your line somewhere, or you completely lose your mind, but but that, the connections that we're talking about antedate, as I said, antedate the Republic. Equiano's and he's even more than Phyllis Wheatley. She is an she's someone from Boston who goes to Britain and finds her international success there. But Equiano is even more indeterminate, depending on where you think he was born. There's some debate about that, but assuming he really is born in, as he says he was, Vincent Coretta is a little cagey on this one. I don't know that we know. Was he born in, Virginia, or was he born in Africa? But, what is he? A lot of people could claim him. Is he African? Is he Afro-British? Is he African-American? We all claim him. But going back to Cillian, I guess what I was going to say to is I think that what we see is people, Black artists and intellectuals, dealing around the same similar issues, discussing similar issues, and there is continuity to some degree. If you get Glissant. And did you say Shoenka? Was it that you said you saw?
Yes.
Yeah. If you get them talking with each other, obviously there's some level that they're talking with each other. And they know about each other's work. Frankly, they probably met at the radical Black and Third World Book Fair. Shoenka got honored there. He got they had a whole a book fair that was dedicated to, honoring Shoenka, so that they talk, but they're not necessarily going to come up with the same sort of thing. Just like here, Amiri Baraka may say he loved, he might have said that he was sort of in the camp of Maulana Karenga here in his cultural nationalist days, but he never ever, even for a second, ever gave up the blues or jazz or R&B the way that Karenga wanted him to. He just wouldn't go there, as that was true of a lot of these songs, people. So here was the same way, as you'd have people. There was no part, unless you were in the Black Panthers or something. That was a pretty decentralized organization, despite its rhetoric. There was no disciplinary. It wasn't the Communist Party, where you could be kicked out, tried and kicked out. It was very diverse, as we like to say these days. Does that help? I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Tadiwa?
Hi, thanks, James, for this great talk. I wanted to say two quick comments and then a specific question about the fair and funding and politics. But first, I wanted to say, in relation to what Kate was saying from a Southern African perspective, it was really interesting thinking about certain Zimbabwean writers that might have been there or educated at that time, like a Dambudzo Marichera, for example. And your talk opened up questions for me about how we read certain Southern African writers who were very influenced by sort of Black arts movements in England, but are usually taught in more nationalistic terms as like Zimbabwean writers specifically, and not sometimes read in terms of their diasporic associations. And also, I did my master's in the UK around 2015, which was an interesting time, both because the Rhodes Must Fall South African movement and the Black Lives Matter movement was influencing a lot of the ways that people were debating the term Blackness in the UK at that time. And we weren't thinking like about previous moments that could have been helpful to us, but it was interesting for me as a Southern African student who was kind of taught, whose higher education was mostly in the US, to go to the UK. And I was at Oxford at that time. And I remember we tried to set up a Black students union and it did not work out. So the term Blackness is always interesting in terms of how the various kind of international movements that are happening bring out a lot of tension and a lot of solidarity. But I was just curious about the funding for the International Fair of the Radical Black and Third World books, because a lot of the tension with like Festac, for example, particularly like Festac 77, was about like the government's involvement and giving money to the festival, but also their own like political political demands of festivals. And same with the Zimbabwe International Festival, it's like people might have radical politics, but depending on whether it's state funded or whether it's like self-funded, that shapes a lot of what kinds of conversations can be had at this fair. So I just wanted to know a little bit more about kind of the organizing behind that particular fair and how it kind of shaped the atmosphere or how people are relating to each other.
That's a really good question, and I don't really know the answer, or don't completely know the answer to that question. It's something I need to find out more about. I mean, I thought your comments about Southern Africa are quite interesting, and I'll just say, you know, I mean, I think what you're saying is true. I mean, and certainly there's this South African radical presence both in British and in US Black arts is, you know, again, as far as pronouncing names, but Keropetsi Kagatsili, or Willie as he was generally known here, was a very familiar presence. He was here, I think initially as sort of a part of the cultural wing of the ANC, and with the United Nations became a very familiar figure of the Black arts movement here in the United States. And so that there were connections, I mean, actually tangible, real connections here, as well as the UK, as well as a deep interest in it. The other thing I would say is that for reasons that have to do, again, with a question that you don't want to ask me about Marxist politics, but that because Marxist politics in both the United States and South Africa actually resembled each other for various historical reasons more than they did, say, between the UK and South Africa or the United States and South Africa. It's one of the reasons why the Communist Party, you know, I mean, you know, Nelson Mandela was a member of the Communist Party. I mean, you know, in South Africa, you know, why they had that influence there. going back to your other question about, I mean, the initial organization of the book fair was between New Beacon, and Bogle Literature and Race Today, and they're the ones who found the money. Where they got all the money from, I don't know. I think as things went on, in part it had to do, and again, I'm not an expert on British local politics or British politics, but my understanding was that as Thatcherism took shape in Britain and took kind of control of Britain nationally, local councils like the greater, the city councils, if you will, which have more power there, or did at one time, actually not anymore, I don't think, but did at one time have more power than, say, many city councils do in the United States. But like the Greater London Council, especially under Ken Livingstone, which was a kind of left-wing or led group. I mean, part of the way that they resisted Thatcherism, part of the way you could say that they protested against Thatcherism, was by funding various sorts of cultural initiatives, including Black cultural initiatives, say in London. So I'd be very surprised if it didn't turn out that, at least for some of that time, that a fair amount of the money for this thing, because it must have cost a lot of money to get people from Africa and from North America and the Caribbean to the UK, that came from them. That it also might be a reason why in the 90s it dies out, because politics in London and the power of these groups change. It's a different, London starts becoming a different kind of place in some respects. That's my guess. But
Jim,
I need to know more.
It occurs to me that one use you could make of our virtual existence is to interview all these people right from your study or wherever you are right now on Zoom, and and record it, and just start with these basic fundamental questions, which would save you a whole lot of time, because they're not, some of these things aren't written about, but there are a lot of people like Gregor, or David, and and Catherine Hall, my God, and just interview them. I mean, just book it and do it. I would really encourage you to do it. I think that would be as important as the reading that you're doing.
That's part of the plan. I mean, there are some people who aren't going to do it on Zoom, but yes, I mean, I've talked to some people already, but I've got to do more. Anyway, Krishna has let me know that we got to try to get everybody in. Or we have more folks, Krishna?
Yes, we have one question. If we could get to that quickly, Marwa. Thank you.
Yes, hi, thank you so much for this talk, Jim. I really enjoyed listening to the conversation and the questions that everyone's raising about, what does it mean to be Black at this time? What is Pan-Africanism? What are the limitations and possibilities of that? And it got me thinking, I know you're not talking about this particular period that I'm going to mention, but I know you're working in like this 60s, 70s, 80s. But I was thinking one relevant story, and you might have already heard of him, but Dusay Muhammad Ali, is, right? He's somebody who really speaks to the complexity of these issues. Being an Egyptian Sudanese, he's living in the late 19th century. By 1912, he's in the UK, and he founds the journal called the African Review and Oriental Times, or African Times and Oriental Review. And he's in touch with Marcus Garvey. He actually is international in the sense that he travels between the UK, the United States, and also West Africa. He's an actor, he's a journalist, he is an intellectual, and I just think that his story is so interesting because he tried to get a visa. He's Egyptian by nationality, which at this time is also part of this larger British Empire. And so he tries to get a visa to go to West Africa for business. And it's the, you know, the UK that's really raising questions about his identity, who he is and how to classify him. You're a subject of the Ottomans, so what are you? You're but you're Black appearing, but you're also Sudanese. What? So all of these questions were raised, you know, so much, I guess, in advance of the time period that you're talking about as well. And I wondered if you had come across him, or if you thought about sort of how that, we're talking about Africa as well, right? So how do different Africans fit into this broader Black arts movement between the UK and
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. You know, and also I've thought about this as you've talked about your stuff, because both, you know, yeah, I mean, I have to decide how much I want, but he's definitely, and that sort of idea is definitely part of the sort of one of my prehistory chapter that I didn't talk about too much today, you know, because how much of this stuff can you stand? But that, but I also think in the period that I'm talking, you know, that's a really pertinent question, right? I mean, certainly, what we might think of as the Arab nationalist revolutions. This also occurred to me, you know, the Arab nationalist revolutions, when you think about the rise of a certain kind of left Arab nationalism is really very important in the discourse and in the conversations that are going on. So that's another one of these. Someone like Nasser, for example, would be considered, I mean, he was unquestionably Black to these activists. I mean, or that Egypt was unquestionably a part of the Black world. That Algeria, regardless of what the phenotype of the person that you're talking about, I mean, obviously that certainly might have made a difference, you know, which can be variable. They were really crucial parts of the Black world. I mean, in terms of Black radicalism too, I mean, Egypt is incredibly important, of course, because, you know, one of the sort of transformative moments as a sort of run up to the Black radicalism that we're talking about in the 60s, 70s, and 80s is the other crisis of 1956, besides the crisis of what we might think of as international communism or international Marxism, with Khrushchev's speech about saying to the Soviet Communist Party, you know, the stuff that our enemies have been saying about Stalin, about his crimes. Well, he did a lot of that stuff. That was really shocking to people, and that caused all kinds of ruptures. But the other crisis, of course, was the Suez crisis. And that was really the moment where, you know, that was a transformative moment for many Black radicals, people like Du Bois, for example, people like Robeson and so forth, in terms of their thinking about who is who in the colonial world, who is connected to who in the colonial world. And so what I'm saying is that I think you're raising a really good point that, I mean, I went on probably too long, but that, you know, I should think more about Jews, because certainly Egypt is very much a part of this, and particularly Egypt, because it had been a semi-colony of Britain, very much in this sort of broader, you know, London or Britain, US, Caribbean, Africa discussion. Does that, so thank you. The short form is thank you.
Oh, thank you. I think we should end here. We've covered a lot, though we didn't really get to
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you.